least 25 people have been killed. This in the Afghan capital.
Then, as journalists rushed to the scene, a second bomber detonated his device.
Worst death toll for media workers in the country.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. 10 journalists killed in a single day in Afghanistan as the security situation there deteriorates. In Cambodia, the buyout of a newspaper leads to mass resignations. Solitary confinement, USA. It's a huge story, and some of the prisoners are now doing the reporting. And in Israel, a new video game where the enemy is an anti-occupation activist armed with a video camera. The Afghan journalists rushing to the site of an explosion 2 weeks ago in Kabul were trying to cover the news. They didn't realize it was a setup. In the aftermath, a second suicide bomber disguised as a news cameraman detonated his device. The attacks claimed by the Islamic State left 29 people dead, including 9 journalists. Another Afghan reporter was shot dead that same day. The carnage was a brutal reminder of the perils of being in the news business in Afghanistan. Phenomenal growth in the media there is considered one of the tangible positive legacies of the 2001 coalition invasion. But 4 years after the drawdown of foreign troops, a worsening overall security environment has put journalists under all kinds of new pressures. Already targeted by militant groups like the Taliban and the Islamic State, news outlets are also getting heat from the government side. Parliamentary elections are coming up this year, and some officials are clearly out to muzzle the news media. Our starting point this week is the site of the bombings in Kabul.
It was the bloodiest attack on journalists in the history of Afghanistan, and we lost some of the best journalists Afghanistan had.
Our cameraman, Yar Mohammad Tohi, Shamarai Faizi, AFI photojournalist, Kakar from Radio Free Europe, Salim from Mashal TV, most of them were young generation.
That was one of the deadliest incidents for Afghanistan media and for Afghanistan journalists, because this one was directly targeting reporters.
The first explosion took place at 8 a.m. The journalists who rushed to the scene would not have had time to notice that one of the cameramen there was an imposter. They would have assumed he was one of them. 15 minutes later, his hollowed-out camera, crammed with explosives, was detonated. The subsequent news feeds contained far more images from the aftermath of the first bombing than the second, because after the second explosion, there were fewer journalists alive to take them. Sometimes it's the relative lack of pictures that tell the story.
In the scene, there were some other groups of people around, civilians, security forces, but based on the reports we have, the one who was carrying a bomb, it was installed within a camera, and it exploded just right among the journalists and reporters, and that led to a big loss for Afghanistan media family. This is something that we'll not forget, we'll not forgive either.
None of my colleagues or journalists from other media outlets expected the second attack, because he was disguised as a journalist and he was trying to make everybody feel like he's one of them. Journalists might be very careful after this. Now the fear has spread, and probably they would be very, very reluctant sending out the journalists to the bomb blast site. This is going to affect the whole media situation in Afghanistan.
To honor the victims and protest the treacherous conditions that Afghan journalists face, one paper, Hashtag Sob, published a blackened front page. The editors did the very same thing 2 years ago, when Taliban fighters attacked a van load of journalists from the country's biggest television channel, Tolo TV, killing 7 of them. Although responsibility for this week's twin explosions was claimed by the Islamic State, the Taliban represents a much wider threat to journalists. The group now controls or contests more territory, roughly 40% of the country, than at any time since the invasion of 2001. And wherever the Taliban is making a comeback, journalists have reason to fear or watch their words.
Militant groups don't want their atrocities to be covered and reported. And it's basically the media who highlights, who reveals atrocities that they commit.
نظامیان کشور طالبان را متهم می‌سازند که با گرفتن اداره خوابگاه دختران دانشگاه کندوز شمار از دختران این خوابگاه تجاوز کردند.
The attack of terrorist groups against media are mainly because of these reasons. The Taliban attacked a van carrying employees of Tolo TV in January 2016. In that incident, 7 of the employees of that TV station were killed, and it resulted in a huge wave of self-censorship all across Afghanistan. The objective of the Taliban to create black holes, to create information black holes.
Taliban are attacking not only journalists, but the telecommunication towers and other structures that are related to media and communication. They are trying to destroy the very fabric of the media and communication, so people don't have first-hand and correct information. And this has, of course, created a kind of fear in the hearts of the journalists.
The Taliban's conflict with journalists and journalism goes way back. The group ruled most of Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. It banned television altogether, declaring it blasphemous, and strictly controlled other forms of media. The US-led invasion of 2001 deposed the Taliban, but at a heavy price. As many as 170,000 civilians have been killed in the fighting since, and successive governments, although democratically elected, have proven to be corrupt. However, the growth of the media sector, much of it fueled by Western money pumped into the country, has been deemed a success. Afghans now have more than a dozen television channels and more than 100 radio stations to inform them, and the freedom the Afghan media have compares favorably to many of their neighbors. Now, one of the few allegedly successful legacies of the US-led coalition invasion of vibrant media space is at risk.
The growing pressure on journalists in recent years has created self-censorship. That's number one. Number two, it's going to weaken the capability of media outlets to cover stories, particularly stories of atrocities. Number three, it's gonna encourage a lot of journalists to leave the profession. So the long-term effect of this will be that we will lose much of the press freedom that we have in Afghanistan today, which is the most vibrant press freedom in the region.
The Afghan media are also coming under increasing pressure from the body that's supposed to offer them protection, the government. The Afghan Journalists' Safety Committee says that over the last half of 2017, government workers, politicians, and police were responsible for almost 1/3 of incidents involving either violence against or intimidation of media workers. Journalists who produce stories about corruption often become targets of state officials.
We have faced with many challenges with both sides, with militants and inside with government. The militants, they are targeting us directly, but the government officials, they try to censor, they try to limit our access to information. They're happy for free press in Afghanistan until we focus on their weaknesses and we focus on their corruptions.
Because we name and shame some of them who are engaged in corruption. And whenever you report on something, they try to blackmail you and accuse you for doing something against the national interest of the country. But we have a law and regulation which is supporting us. We have a system here. We have a media complaint commission. But when it comes to threats from Taliban, there is no institutions to go there and resolve the case. So once they threat you or send you a message, so you have to be careful, because now it seems that they're serious. Once they send a message, they will continue to kill.
As the head of news at Tolo TV put it, the Taliban choose their targets carefully, but the Islamic State targets everyone. Like one of Tolo's cameramen, Yar Mohammed Tohi, who perished in the second explosion, having been lured there by the first. His equipment bears the stains, and his colleagues bear the scars after the mother of all attacks against journalism in Afghanistan.
We're discussing another media story that's on our radar this week with one of our producers, Johanna Hoos. Jo, in Cambodia, where freedom of the press is a growing issue, the sale of a newspaper has become a major news story. Why is that?
Well, Richard, it's because the new owner appears to have close ties to the government. These are ties that he strongly denies, but that some journalists at his paper clearly wanted to make known to readers. The paper is the English-language Phnom Penh Post, and a Malaysian investor called Jiva Kumar Ganapathy just bought it. Now, this guy also owns a public relations firm that provides what it calls covert PR and features Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen in its list of previous clients. Now, a day after the paper's sale, the editors decided to publish an article with details of this connection. The new management fired the editor-in-chief and took the article off the website. Now, I spoke with Aaron Handley, who is one of the Post's many employees who resigned in protest.
What we saw was that the new owner was interfering with our editorial independence by demanding that we take down that article. And we feared that that set a dangerous precedent, and we couldn't stand for that. It was a decision that we agonized over. Many of us were very tempted or really wanted to stay put to support our Cambodian colleagues. But I think for many of us who ultimately resigned, something had been broken, and it seemed like it couldn't be undone, or that it wouldn't be. And so leaving the post, I think, was a matter of time.
And the Prime Minister is currently running for re-election. That vote's coming up in July. So presumably this story is being seen against that context.
Yes, it is. And back in 2013, Hun Sen lost a significant share of the vote. So this time around, it looks like he isn't leaving much to chance. In the last few months, his government has systematically silenced a number of media outlets. Now, a dozen radio stations had their licenses suspended last August. And then the Cambodia Daily, which is a newspaper known for its critical coverage of the government, was forced to shut down over tax charges that many say were trumped up. As Aaron Handley told me, the Post's takeover will do nothing to calm fears for press freedom ahead of the vote.
So in Cambodia, there is a broader political and media crackdown. A man was arrested on his wedding day for saying on Facebook that the government was authoritarian. Just the other day, a woman was brought in for questioning by the authorities because she wrote a poem that might have made a reference to Prime Minister Hun Sen. So it's looking bad, and there's no question in my mind that there's a campaign to silence dissent before the election. Whether what happened at the Post is part of that or not, I can't say for sure, but it certainly leaves press freedom in a vulnerable state ahead of an important election.
Now, that was Aaron Handley, who just resigned from her reporter's job at the Phnom Penh Post.
Okay, thanks, Jo. Now to the United States and the coverage of a human rights issue that most Americans have probably never heard of: solitary confinement. The numbers are difficult to nail down, but somewhere in the region of 85,000 prisoners in American jails are currently being held in solitary. That's the equivalent of a small city locked up in a cell and isolated for all but 90 minutes a day. The limited coverage of this issue in the U.S. news media comes down mostly to access. The prisons rarely let reporters in to do those stories. Some people have been trying to change that, including independent journalists and advocacy groups working on the margins of the media establishment. They want Americans to know about the inhumane use of solitary confinement in their country. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on the coverage of Americans in isolation, and the journalist who has bypassed prison authorities by using the post office to turn prisoners into reporters.
For James Ridgway, reporting the story of solitary confinement in the US has been something of a solitary pursuit. For nearly a decade, every week, Ridgway visits his local post office, collecting letters sent to him from prisons around the country. The letters serve as key source material because they come from key sources: people held in isolation in 6 by 5 foot cells for 22.5 hours a day for days, weeks, months, even years.
Well, when we started our project, there was literally hardly anything about solitary confinement in the press, in the TV or newscasts or papers. The only way I could connect with people was through letters, through just plain letters. No phones, no emails, no real visits, no press contacts. I sort of thought to myself, these guys are reporters. What they've got to say is the way in. That's the way in. That's the way to break the security.
And you got over 80,000 people in solitary confinement in the United States.
I did experience over 13 years in incarceration, 5 of which was in solitary.
When we mentioned these numbers to folks, they said, no, this can't be happening in America. But yes, it is happening in America. It's happening every day.
Nobody thought about solitary confinement as something that occurs in the United States. You might have thought of it as something that occurs in totalitarian regimes around the world. But solitary confinement in the United States, as a routine and integral and normalized part of our criminal justice system, has really been invisible until very recently.
We were trying to do a report. We wanted to do a report.
No, you can't go on the island. You're gonna have to make a right. Go into this parking lot and just shoot back out that way. That'll take you out.
Can we do anything in the? Can we film anything in the parking lot?
No, you can't videotape here.
On any given day, there are more than 80,000 people held in isolation in the US prison system. Some would say that that constitutes a big story. The problem is that journalists are not allowed into prisons like Rikers Island here in New York City. They have no access. And with no access, it's the story itself that risks being held in isolation.
Underreporting is one problem. Misrepresentation is another. Across TV and film, prisoners held in solitary, portrayed as 21st century boogeymen.
And what's that, Mickey? I'm a natural-born killer.
Psychopaths.
I'll help you catch him, Clary.
Killers.
Don't think I won't remember what your front steps look like, Susan.
That's had an impact. A complex story of a huge problem in the US criminal justice system has been oversimplified in popular culture and in public perception.
You know, I've met people who really believe that the system is balanced, that everyone in solitary deserves to be there because they're violent, you know, but yet have never been to prison. So the only other explanation is where they're receiving these messages from.
Unfortunately, there is still a tendency that prisoners in solitary confinement are portrayed as extremely dangerous people for whom there really is no other alternative, and that's just not the case. Solitary confinement units in the United States are stuffed to the rafters with the mentally ill, with the developmentally disabled. People are put in solitary confinement for having too many postage stamps, for having too many pencils.
They are the walking dead. That's how they're viewed. And what can I say? I mean, you know, I don't view them as a walking, I view them as a fantastic army of reporters. Now, a lot of them don't say much of anything, but every once in a while, you'll get a letter that has real information in it. You'll get a letter that has real information in it that's really valuable in terms of understanding how the system works.
Ridgway has been documenting that system on Solitary Watch, a website he set up back in 2009. He now has correspondence with more than 5,000 subscribed prisoners. The site has reported on every angle, every detail of conditions in isolation, from prisoners' diminished human rights through to their mental health. Last month, Solitary Watch published the most recent essay by Jack Powers, an inmate in Colorado. He's been in isolation for almost 30 years and has contributed several compelling accounts of psychiatric trauma. And then there's Texas inmate Thomas Whitaker. He was facing a death sentence. His regular writings may well have had an impact on the Board of Pardons and Paroles, which decided to spare him.
Solitary Watch get first-hand stories of what these people are being subjected to. They have a tendency of humanizing the folklore and giving them a sense of hope to voice their suffering to the public. It should make societies try to investigate whether or not this is actually occurring.
Most reporters and most newspapers, media, will concentrate on the big bad criminal. So we try to bury him in a polite manner. In a 6x9 cell, he's interesting, but we don't want him to get out. He's sort of a devil, and he is evil. He's always evil.
And of course, we have places like the Marshall Project, Solitary Watch, and even Vice, who have balanced that out by, injecting and infusing, first-hand accounts and narratives into the conversation.
Ridgway is no longer alone in his campaign to get stories on Solitary from the inside.
An inmate would spend...
In October last year, Oprah Winfrey teamed up with CBS 60 Minutes to report on the conditions of prisoners held in the infamous Pelican Bay State Prison in California and the efforts underway there to reduce the use of solitary confinement.
Sometimes years and even decades at a time in this room alone.
Scenes like that, showcasing prisoner conditions, have also made it onto Netflix,
solitary confinement,
HBO,
caged animals,
and the BBC. And it's not just media attention. Before he left office, President Obama introduced a series of directives and guidelines, including an outright ban on juveniles in solitary. It remains unclear whether the Trump administration will roll back on those promises or commit to continued reform. But regardless, audiences are finally hearing from some of the solitary voices. Solitary voices that remain in confinement.
Finally, there was a video game back in the 90s you might remember. It was called Snake. As part of their new advertising campaign, a right-wing political organization in Israel called Im Tirtzu has released an Israeli retro version of the game. But rather than having a snake navigate its way through a grid, it has an Israeli soldier named Yotam trying to find his way home. Among the obstacles in his way, anti-occupation activists armed with video cameras. They're from NGOs like B'Tselem and Checkpoint Watch. And just to avoid any confusion on the part of Israeli gamers, the activists are considered the enemy. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
מהאנשים שהביאו לכם את סוגר שטחים. השתלטולים. וסנייק. מגיע משחק השנה בגרסת רטרו הישראלית. השתולים באים. עזרו ליותם להגיע הביתה בשלום.
פשיסט! השתלט מכאן!
בקרוב שלב בונוס בגץ. שחקו אונליין עם החברים. עכשיו וב8 ביט. השתולים משחקים בזה כבר שנים.
את גאה במה שאת עושה, חיילת בצד טרור?
רוצים לחוות מה מרגישים חיילי צה"ל שנרדפים על ידי ארגוני הקרן החדשה?
לפני הפיגוע היה עימות בין הלוחם שנהרג לבין פעילת מחסום וואץ' שקרא לעברו אתה בושה.
אתה בושה! פשיסט! אללהו אכבר!
עכשיו גם אתם יכולים.
תתבייש, כובש! חורה, חורה, פלסטין!
למה אתם מחכים?
אתה בושה!
הצטרפו לקרב בשתולים.
חורה, חורה, פלסטין!
תיכנסו לקישור והתחילו לשחק מיד.